Hi, everyone. I like POIs. I enjoy taking POIs. I unfortunately do not enjoy seeing messages in chat. So if you have a POI for me, if you could turn on your camera and gesticulate visibly, I will actually do my best to take you. Somebody once told me that I should take more extreme stances on government. And so the stance we're going to take is that we should glorify both nonviolent and violent revolutions alike. I'm going to do three pieces of framing and then I'm going to three central claims. One, there are already a ton of incentives to prefer a nonviolent revolution. Secondly, glorifying nonviolent revolution often erases the role the radical wings played in helping the nonviolent movements find their success. And three, on the nuances of shaping a post-revolutionary state and the best way to make that happen. Firstly, on the framing, who spreads this narrative? I actually don't think this is about historians and the like, because those are the sort of people who spread facts, not glorifying things and pushing their ideology. Rather, I think the most relevant people who spread these narratives are either A, people working to shape current political protest movements, or B, people pushing to build up their states and their state identity in the immediate aftermath of a recent revolution. Second piece of framing, who's the audience of this glorification, or at least who is the audience I care about? Look, we all went to school, we all learned about nonviolent revolution, but actually our opinions on this don't really matter. The people who do really matter are the political activists who are considering in revolution, the political activists participating in revolution, and for the most part, the people who are, rebuilding the state in the immediate aftermath of a successful revolution. Lastly, what do we think the counterfactual is? Because you're going to glorify something, and you're probably just going to glorify the revolutions that worked, not just work to overthrow the government, but to effectively build a nation state afterward. Because all of the people I'm talking about have roughly aligned incentives to do things and to look at the examples of history that worked out for them and say, hey, we're going to follow in this same model, and wasn't it a great model to use? Onto my first central thesis, which is that there are a ton of exogenous incentives to already prefer nonviolent revolution. You get moral legitimacy and public support. It helps you preserve the moral high ground. The movement avoids bloodshed. It becomes harder for opponents to portray them as extremists or criminals. Two, peaceful tactics often attract broader participation from students, workers, religious groups, and international allies, whereas every act of violence has the potential to be alienating to moderates. Secondly, there are just lower human and material costs, right? If you're a kid on a Discord call in Nepal, calling for violence is actually like potentially instigating, potentially risks an act of violence against you or your friends. So you would presumably like to avoid the people you care about getting hurt as much as possible. So if and when like paths to nonviolent protests do emerge, you are probably likely to prefer them. Three, there's just a sustainability of change question, right? Like nonviolent movements are by and large like the thing you want to lean into. Fourth, there's an optionality question. You can try nonviolence first, and then if it doesn't work, you escalate, you get more radical. This is typically what happens over time. Lastly, and I think least relevantly, there are concerns of international participation. It's just easier to get support from the international community if you are seen as nonviolent or primarily nonviolent. It's hard when you lean into like the really bad forms of violence. And I also want to note that all of these mechanisms don't just mean that people have an incentive to be categorically nonviolent. It also means they have an incentive to moderate individual acts of violence that they choose for their given circumstances. This is why, for example, people in Nepal aren't going around killing babies. They are, however, burning the parliament, which they consider to be an acceptable act of violence in the grand scheme of their revolt. Secondly, I want to talk about how glorifying nonviolence often erases the roles radical wings played in helping those nonviolent movements achieve their goals. And I want to contextualize why those radical wings are actually quite important for the nonviolent movement to achieve their goals. Because I think celebrating Mandela as this icon of nonviolence erases the history of the ANC's goddamn car bombs in South Africa. Celebrating Gandhi as like a person who was primarily nonviolent erases the contributions of S.C. Bose, the Tamil Tigers, and all of those who came before to put the British government in a place where the salt marches and the satyagraha were enough to send them over the edge. So why does the existence of violence at the fringes of movements, rather than characterizing the core of the movement, so like a radical wing, why does that often help nonviolent protest movements get what they want? Firstly, you get a contrast effect. Moderates look more reasonable. Governments view the nonviolent wing as the lesser evil and feel pressure to negotiate with them. E.g., in a colonial context, peaceful leaders like Gandhi made the British super eager to work with him, as opposed to the substantially more extremist versions, like Bhagat Singh. Secondly, you expand the pressure spectrum. Violent groups can raise the overall cost of repression for the state, stretching its resources thin. Nonviolent actors apply broad-based civil resistance, and this creates a pincer effect. The state must deal with both the insurgency and mass resistance, and it makes it substantially harder for the state to coordinate its response to these things. I'll take OO. I'll take the point.
The problem with your case is that most of these revolutionaries are communists and Islamists. Why do you want communists and Islamists to win?
most revolutionaries are communists and Islamists. One, I'm not sure that that is true. Two, even if that is true, just saying that they're communists and Islamists doesn't delegitimize the moral legitimacy of their cause. You have to do a lot of work there. Three, many of these states are communist and Islamist. Four, whatever. Thirdly, when you have a radical fringe, you get better psychological leverage because governments want to deal with moderates. You get more mobilization and urgency, right? You can't just deal with the moderates a year or two down the line. You have to deal with them now because otherwise you risk the people who were moderates slowly becoming radicalized and turning to a politically viable fringe element of the revolution. And lastly, you get a carrot and stick dynamic, right? Nonviolent leaders can be like, if you work with us, we'll have a state, you'll get to work together. You, Cecil Rhodes, you can get the Rhodes Scholarship. It's great, isn't it? Whereas the threat of violence means that in another world, Cecil Rhodes isn't walking out of South Africa, much less, or Rhodesia, much less getting a prize named after him. And look, Andrew's going to explore more about how glorifying nonviolence actually makes it harder for violent revolutionaries to feel comfortable working with nonviolent protests. But I'm just going to make the impact of this very clear. It's fine to have protests in a discard call all day. It's fine to fly the Muki di Luffy pirate flag in the streets. But if it takes the burning of the parliament building to bring a new government, I am strongly in favor of that success. Thirdly, on shaping the post-revolutionary state. It's critical to give the violent revolutionaries some credit for their success in their revolution. One, they often feel like they deserve it. Two, they often represent large swaths of the population. And three, they feel like they are losing political credit that they would otherwise have been able to use to justify their participation in the new government and the post-colonial state. And if they don't feel like they are getting the credit they deserve, they often feel pressured to make themselves and their contributions more visible in the post-government, in the post-revolution government and society. And if they can't do that by glorifying their own contributions, well, they often if they can't glorify their own contributive violence in the past, very often they're forced to turn to violence in the present. Often, this looks like an act of violence against the new, deeply unstable government, which has yet to base its roots in and develop its legitimacy amongst the populace. Take, for example, the Russian Revolution, where you had a largely nonviolent mass protest movement that toppled the Tsar and brought in a moderate provisional government. And then it was almost immediately overturned by the Bolsheviks, a highly military faction, because they felt like they didn't get enough credit for their anti-Tsarist activities, and they felt boxed out of participation in the provisional government as a result. Or take, for example, the Iranian Revolution, which started out as a question of broad-based civic disobedience against the Shah, which was coordinated by secular and moderate groups. But the Islamists, Khomeini's faction, ended up consolidating power because they felt like they could not participate in the new state. They felt like they had no choice but to take control. Obviously, sometimes that's going to happen anyway, but it is far more likely to happen when you are categorically opposed to letting these groups participate in your new government.
We thank the Prime Minister very much and are happy to call upon the Leader of the Opposition here. Also remind speakers to offer POIs in the ways that people flag. Actually, no, that was fine. Never mind. That was hello.
Thanks, Ayal. Before I begin my speech, I have two requests. The first is that I'll take POIs non-verbally, so in the chat, though I will explicitly ask for POIs, so don't bother. Don't worry, I won't forget to take you. Second, to those of you who are comfortable doing so, thank you, Bharath. I love when people turn their cameras on. Find it makes the debate a lot more lively and encouraging and fun. Cool. I'll begin my speech momentarily. I find it funny that opening government's example is Subhash Chandra Bose, a Nazi who allied with Hitler. It is good that he has forgotten and opening government is going to drop. 3 pieces of framing. What does this glorification look like? First, you take previously successful peaceful revolutions and you use them as your main source of inspiration. So you refer to things like the revolution in the Philippines, like the Satyagraha in India. And critically, as opening government explicitly concedes, you emphasize the moral superiority of nonviolent action relative to violent action, i.e. it is morally better to be nonviolent and we should pursue nonviolence in all cases. Second, who glorifies nonviolent revolutions? It tends to be leaders within these movements who already have a certain degree of buy-in, a certain degree of political popularity. Perhaps they have a compelling story. They spent months in jail like Gandhi or Mandela, and they use this political power to be able to convince their population not to have a violent revolution, to calm down the angry individuals who are in their movements. Third, people have an intrinsic bias against violence. They don't want themselves to be harmed or their children to be harmed or their communities to be burned down, but they choose violence, as opening government correctly suggests, when they are hopeless. Our claim is that even when you are hopeless, you should not choose violence and you should still default to nonviolent protest. Argument for one more piece of framing. Why is the counterfactual the glorification of violent revolutions? And again, open-end government agrees with this. First, in situations where people are feeling angry, populism is a simple solution. Eat the rich, kill the minorities. It's a simple slogan. People are prone to violence. There's often strong historical precedent around ethnic and racial tensions, especially in countries that do have a significant amount of revolutionary incentives. For example, if you have an ethnic majority or even an ethnic minority running the government, like the Tigray people in Ethiopia, you often have a significant incentive to drum up hatred against those particular people. Second, often there's visceral anger towards their oppressors, and leaders often weaponize this. So you need an extremely strong countervailing narrative to ensure that people do not push for violent action and violent revolution. Third, you often have the hopeless glorification. Often you have the glorification of revolutions that have been violent in the past, like the overthrow of the Parliament of Nepal, like the 1989 Iranian Revolution. Our arguments are the following two things. First, this probably doesn't change the existence of revolutions. Those happen symmetrically because of the anger people have towards their states. But the way people respond to revolutions, the actions their leaders make, and what their followers expect them to do, and we stop violence and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Second, we have a significantly better government after the conflict. Argument one, why do we stop violence? And there are two burdens here. First, we change the behavior of the movement and of their leaders, because you make the revolution path dependent on the worst excesses of violence. When people believe they have a strong moral obligation to be nonviolent because their respected and beloved leader told them, if you are violent, you are an immoral actor, people like Gandhi, that is when you stop the worst excesses of violence, when you stop violent revolutionaries burning the parliament down. And I would note that a lot of innocent people die when you burn the parliament down. The janitors who were in the parliament building, the people who were living in the surrounding neighborhoods, because violence is something that revolutions cannot control, and it gets out of control very quickly insofar as looters and rioters begin mixing in with the individuals who are protesting and begin causing chaos. And in the aftermath of that chaos, it's extremely hard for the government to be able to rebuild. And this is important because the leaders of revolutions tend to change, to be killed, to be arrested by the incumbent government. But if the movement glorifies nonviolence, it makes the future leaders path dependent on being nonviolent. Insofar as that is true, it means you have subsets of revolutions that are independent from the main leaders, like Bose in India, no longer being able to gain a large amount of political support because the main populace believes they are immoral for doing so per opening government's explicit concession. Secondarily, on crackdown and negotiation. When government leaders fear they will be shot and killed, they have a stronger incentive to retaliate and crack down to inspire fear within you. The comparative is that when government officials know that offers of amnesty and immunity are likely to be followed through, when the leaders and their people won't be violent because they want to preserve their moral image and not kill you or throw you in prison for a very long period of time, they're far more likely to be willing to come to the negotiating table as opposed to fight to their last dying breath. This is important because oftentimes what you have with revolutions are protracted conflicts and guerrilla wars. And critically, revolutions often result in splintering and fragmentation between states. So you often have, like, for example, a revolution concentrated in the liberal cities. Often you have rural areas that are controlled by the government who still has military forces there. And oftentimes you have the food supply being cut off, which is how you get economic devastation and famine. Before I go on, closing government.
Yeah, as op in this debate, you're defending the status quo, right? Is the status quo one where revolutions aren't violent and states don't crack down?
The status quo is a world where nonviolent revolutions are overwhelmingly glorified and an overwhelming amount of revolutions happen peacefully. This is something we're happy to defend. Robi can defend this more in DLO. The weighing of this is quite simple. It is relatively speculative that revolutions will succeed, and it is even more speculative that these revolutions, whether violent or non-violent, are going to cause a margin in the likelihood of the revolution to succeed or not succeed. The intuitive framing here is that the reason why governments collapse during a revolution is usually because they have lost control of the state. For example, the military no longer backs them, or they've lost support of key economic actors. And these things usually aren't contingent on the revolution being violent or non-violent, just on you reaching a critical mass of people who are angry enough at the state to want the state to no longer exist, to strike, to protest, to do all other forms of non-violent revolution that don't result in you taking up arms and trying to overthrow the state. And so the upshot of this is, insofar as it is certain that we stop violence, that we create a strong countervailing narrative to have people we consider being violent, this is an extremely good thing for us to claim because we get to claim a certain impact of lives saved during the process. Secondarily, why do we get a significantly better government after the conflict ends? And this is quite intuitive. The first reason is that the West tends to fetishize human rights because the West likes to project a reason why they are in charge as them being moral actors, like the United States liking to like the United States and the United Kingdom and other Western states establishing human rights courts and following human rights law and making proclamations about human rights, like Keir Starmer and Alfred Albanese's recent declaration of Palestine as a state, even though both actors continue to fund Israel. I may withdraw consent after this speech. But secondarily, insofar as that is true, oftentimes a lot of humanitarian aid, a lot of peace awards, and a lot of international clout are premised on the incumbent government not being perceived as bloodthirsty killers and bloodthirsty terrorists, people like Gandhi, people like Mandela, which makes it significantly easier for you to govern because you have a source of money to replace the money that left when the revolution was happening. Secondarily, you're able to, your base calls for less violent after. And the important framing of this is when you glorify violence in violent revolutions, which is the counterfactual that OG defends, people often don't de-escalate from that violence after the revolution has ended because they're often still angry. You've drummed them up for months or for years as to how one particular ethnic group or one particular socioeconomic group is responsible for all the destruction. And when you tell them, I want you to stop, they often don't listen and agree to stop. So you often have violence after the revolution ends, which makes it functionally impossible to govern the state and creates a massive amount of internal instability. For all those reasons, clear opening opposition.
We thank the Leader of the Opposition very much, and I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. I will take a POI probably around 5 minutes, 5.5 minutes. I'll ask for it verbally. Cool. Is anyone not ready? O is right about one thing. People who live under brutal oppression are desperate and angry. Critically, this means that violence will happen on both sides of the house. There's a certain set of people who are going to be radicalized, who are going to feel as if there is no actual participation in the political system, that it will ameliorate them from their hellish conditions. So they will engage in violence in both worlds, which means the burden op has is not to prove that violence is always bad. Rather, they have to prove that the set of violence they defend is actually better than the set of violence we defend. My contribution to this round is extremely simple. We're going to explain why the types of violence that occur on their side of the house are worse when there's a narrative that explicitly glorifies nonviolence than a world in which there are at least countervailing narratives or an emphasis on looking at successful revolutions. First question then, purely violent groups will be purely violent in both worlds. Like, guys, the example of a Nazi is really, really bad for them because people who are bought into extreme right-wingist ideology are already extremely radicalized. This debate is about the median activist group, with people who both believe in nonviolence and also people who, per the arguments from OO's own framing, probably believe that some degree of violence is necessary. Critically, Nazis will valorize Nazis no matter what. It's unclear why this actually applies to the median revolutionary group. Second, what is our narrative? Because our narrative is not uncritically glamorizing violence. Their arguments are extraordinarily uncharitable. Their arguments are just like, some people are racist, so this will be done in a racist and aggrandizing way. The issue with this is, one, these are symmetric incentives to glorify violence in both worlds, in which case it's very unclear why it is the case that OO has any actual unique impact in this round. And secondly, and more importantly, this ignores the actor debate that actually Audi gives you in the PM, which is specifically these individuals that we're talking about are revolutionaries. So maybe they're right and there's some incentive for political leaders to scapegoat on either side of the house. But given revolutionaries who are often disenfranchised from the system want the maximal degree of buy-in, Audi gives you a whole boatload of reasons why the natural incentive then is not to glorify violence in our world, because shamelessly glorifying violence makes people feel like it's unsafe to participate in your revolution, but rather why you selectively pick and choose. You say this violent revolution in Nepal was successful, but not this one in this other country. You say this instance of nonviolence was successful, but not this instance of nonviolence on their side of the house. This means our framing push is extremely simple. Given there's extreme, overwhelming incentives for most individuals to engage in nonviolence on their side of the house, why is it the case that glorification is the meaningful tipping point on any of OO's positive impacts? Cool. I'm going to now prove that we activate good types of revolutionary violence and they only get bad types of revolutionary violence. The glorification of nonviolent revolutionaries makes violent revolutionaries within your group less likely to listen. And per the framing argument, obviously it's not the case that some revolutionary groups are purely nonviolent and others are purely violent, because often you're limited by practicalities. You don't have the infinite choice to opt into whatever revolutionary group you want, because those groups are being cracked down upon. You often only have one or two options, which means you're willing to join revolutionary groups that disagree with you and willing to engage in dialogue with people who want violence when you're a nonviolent protester. Why do they make instances of violence substantially worse on their side of the house? A, they create a psychological distancing effect, i.e., in their world, there's an incentive to push for stuff harder when you're a violent revolutionary with more hard-line rhetoric to glorify your own violent leaders much more because you're actively fighting against the wing of your own revolutionaries that are telling you that nonviolence is the only answer. Like, guys, OO's solution to being desperate is literally just go out in the street and get beaten by the cops and protest no matter what. That's not a fucking solution. And more importantly, that's not a solution that most revolutionaries are psychologically comfortable with accepting, which means that when you tell them that their acts of violence are unacceptable, they feel like they can no longer work with you within these movements. B, nonviolent revolutionaries are just less willing to listen or negotiate themselves when they perceive their own side as morally correct. I.e., the delta here is maybe nonviolent revolutionaries still think nonviolence is good in our world, but they don't believe it as like the unipolarly correct moral superiority, the only position they're capable of having. It's not just that violence isn't the right tool in the toolbox, but that pacifism is the moral high road that must be taken in all instances, and violence is always bad. This is extremely bad for a number of reasons. One, per the above, it causes people who disagree to feel disenfranchised. Two, it means you just don't work with these individuals. You refuse to work with violent revolutionaries within your revolutionary group. You drive them out. You cause more fracturing and splintering, which triggers literally all of OO impacts, but substantially worse on their side of the house. Two, it means that you turn to more extreme violent groups, the Nazis instead of the conservatives, because you feel that you cannot work with non-violent revolutionaries. I'm going to pause. There's something important in the chat. They say my debate partner has dropped
Yeah,
out.
my debate partner has dropped out.
I don't know how to handle this. Can someone who knows the rules please
yeah.
explain?
Yeah, let's pause the timer.
I myself have 419 elapsed.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we're supposed to continue until the end of the speech and then pause at the end of the speech. No?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Then carry on, please.
No. I'm asking. Is anyone versed,
I
aware
think
of?
that's the rule, I think.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to continue from 419, and then we will pause at the end of the speech. Okay.
Cool.
Hey, sorry if that sorry.
That's okay. You're good. Okay. Is anyone not ready? Okay, sorry. Okay. See, because violent revolutionaries in these groups literally never get credit on their side of the house, if I'm someone who feels rightfully disenfranchised by the cops beating people I care about, then I never feel like I'm able to be represented in these legitimate revolutionary groups. I'm much more to turn to individual and vigilanteous acts of violence or to these violent splinter groups. What are the impacts? Why did they completely take OO out of the round? Even if they defend fewer instances of violence happening in their world, the instances that do happen are much, much, much worse because the burden that OO set for themselves of explaining that political violence is never a good thing is obviously ridiculous. There are many instances, CF, for example, Nepal or India pre-Gandhi, or many instances in which violence is probably necessary. I'll do work on this later, which means that if they defend a much more intense set of cases in which the violence is done less rationally, they flip literally all of their own impacts. Why then do they get more not bad violence on their side of the house? First, there's just negotiations within groups that break down. Parts of the group commit violence while others don't, which creates fragmenting and splintering on their side of the house. Two, it just generically increases radicalization. There's lots of people living under oppressive regimes who feel angry and now feel like they do not have a legitimate revolutionary outlet. What is the bottom line of this argument? First, there's crackdowns in both worlds, but they actually make crackdowns worse because when you have splinter groups doing more violent things, guess who you crack down on as the government? It's not the splinter group living in the mountains you can't find. It's the mainstream group that seems to support the same positions, but it's much easier to target because they don't engage in violent or evasive actions relative to the government. I'll take a POI from closing.
If there is ambiguity on whether or not people should or can be violent because you're trying to be balanced, wouldn't that create greater fragmentation on your side?
No, because you leave it an open question. You say perhaps violence is the right answer in this question, perhaps it is not. On your side of the house, you make it a closed question. You say no, do not propose violence. It is always the wrong answer. That's literally what OO defends at the top of the speech. Finally, then, when do people choose violence? Their argument is desperation. I think this is insufficient to cause people to do violence rationally. It's only sufficient to cause irrational actors to do violence. Rational actors face a few problems we solve. A, there's a first action problem. Often they want someone else to do something about it. They don't want to be the mother who dies defending their child. They much rather be another mother who does that instead. But B, there's a strong threshold to violence which often feels worse than abstract oppression. That is, oftentimes the oppression that occurs in autocratic regimes is not occurring in your kitchen, it's occurring in the concentration camps which are around the corner, which means that uniquely on our side of the house, we push back on the narrative that pacifism is always the answer, and we cause rational acts of violence as a result of rational discourse within revolutionary groups. Whereas on their side of the house, the only people committing violence are when they feel like they're disenfranchised and they feel like the only way is to scream against the oppressive Gnostic creator God who has designed the horrid governmental system in which they live. So look, our top line and our bottom line are very, very simple. One, people need to be naturally pushed to do violence when violence is good. Two, the counterfactual is worse extremism on the edges and more fracturing. Three, that controls the link into crackdowns because governments will do bad things as a result. For these reasons, proud to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister very much and are happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
If I disconnect at any point in my speech, which I might because my internet is choppy, please pause my timer and let me know in chat. Just because violent revolutions exist in the status quo doesn't mean that they can't get so much worse. On side government, you have more instances like Syria, when the disenfranchised revolutionaries that government bench talked about, i.e. the Islamists, came into power, deposed Assad, and created horrors much greater than Assad ever did, such as killing Christians on the streets who were forced to walk like dogs before they were slaughtered. The first piece of framing I want to deal with from government bench is that the violence that they will propose in the revolutionary groups is going to be strategic and is only going to look up to revolutionary groups that have succeeded in the past. So their model is that you're going to only glorify some violence. Why is this unlikely going to be the case? Firstly, because the most historically relevant instances of violent revolutions were those that were extremely brutal, and those are glorified the most. This looks like the Stalinist revolution in Russia, which starved millions of people. This looks like Mao's communist revolution that killed tens of millions of farmers. And right now we have people all across the world screaming, globalize the Intifada. It's entirely asserted from OG that these groups of revolutionaries are rational actors who are looking at numbers. They're probably looking at movements that have the most political capital, which tend to be movements that were historically the most successful, which are the bloodiest movements. Secondly, the movements that were overwhelmingly violent and radical are those that are supported by large states, such as China, because you align with a big ideology. So you're likely going to align or attach onto an important ideology, such as Islam or communism, because these are big ideologies. Thirdly, angry people, especially people who are suffering from state violence, aren't rational. They want bloodlust, which means that if you are a leader, you're likely going to want to be extremely violent to tap into the bloodlust of your people. But fourthly, it's very hard to control revolutionaries and to control a violent revolution once it starts. Once you have paramilitary groups fighting guerrilla warfare on the streets, you can't control what the random guy in your party will do when he is alone in a room with a woman and a child and things like that. When you have more violence, things become very erratic very quickly. So for all of these reasons, what we're going to give on their side of the house, if the sole narrative is glorifying violence because they can't fiat having both, because note, the motion says that they regret the glorification of peaceful revolutions. So on our side of the house, we can have both. On their side of the house, when you don't have the glorification of peaceful revolutions, the exclusive thing you have is the glorification of violent revolution. You have more of them on their side of the house. But their compelling response to this is to say, aha, but when you don't include these radical degenerate people, they will instead splinter off from your movement and become even worse. No, they will actually fail at recruitment when we give them a compelling counter-narrative of non-violence. Why will non-violence stop recruitment into these violent groups and actually get more of their people to join in their non-violent movements? Firstly, because most people have an intuitive bias against violence. It hurts us to see another person suffering. The reason why people go into violence is when, as per the OG characterization, they think this is the only narrative. But when, as Arjun says, you glorify successful non-violent movements, like Gandhi's movement, and when you don't focus on the violence in South Africa, but when instead you glorify Mandela as the most important figure, and people know, I don't have to be violent. Violence isn't the only pathway. I can choose an alternative, which means more people join non-violent groups. But secondly, you have social distancing, as OG says. You can tell to yourself, I am not that kind of a person who would commit violence in the first place. But thirdly, even if we have some people who splinter off, who become more violent, we're very happy to cooperate with the state to have them arrested. We're happy to disavow them. We're not going to fund them. So sure, we have splinter groups, but those splinter groups are going to be defunded. They're not going to get weapons. We're happy to cooperate with the state to turn them in. On their side of the house, when you glorify violence, you give more power to these people. But let's take them at their best and say that revolutionary groups are the only groups that do this. Government bench never explains why revolutionary groups are a priori better than the government. Of course, it's easy to villainize the government, but often revolutionary groups are even worse. Why? Because if you want to rise atop of a paramilitary group, you have to be ruthless, you have to be brutal, you have to be the kind of a person who is willing to endure pain and suffering and state persecution and often sacrifice a lot of your men to win, which means that these people are often psychopaths or people who are willing to engage in extremely violent behavior. But secondly, after the revolutionary state, you want to create stability, which means that often you kill your dissidents and create a reign of terror. This is what happened in Russia, where you killed your allies and you killed the kulaks and things like that. Thirdly, you don't have any experience ruling. So often, even when these revolutionaries win, when they depose of the previous corrupt government, what's going to replace it? There's a vacuum. So taking government bench at their best, when these are extreme, like oppressive governments, it's unclear we're replacing them in the first place is going to lead any good insofar as these revolutionary groups are just as bad. I'm happy to take closing.
Yeah, so the reason revolutionary groups are often better than the government is that in the cases where they succeed, they have the groundswell of people behind them, which means that they are likely to be the less radical, less brutal, less dictatorial people.
No, so the people who are installed empirically are the people who are leaders of the paramilitary groups, who are often inspired by radical ideologies like communism or Islamism and who have no experience ruling and who eliminate all of the dissidents. I explained this. But also note, state retaliation becomes significantly worse when you proactively support violence as part of the entire group. Because if you're a part of a movement, and you disavow the radicals, then the state, or rather they can co-opt you. They can say, aha, he is one of the good ones. There are people in this ethnicity who don't want violence. However, when you yourself, as the leader, agree with the groups who commit violence, then the state is going to crack down on everyone. Then they have the prerequisite to actually have a blanket oppressive policies to imprison more people, to have more crackdowns, to have more brutality. But secondly, when you have more war and more revolution, you have prolonged warfare. And when you have prolonged warfare in big cities, you have things like famine, things like no access to medical supplies and things like that. But I think the best case coming from OG is the moderates look better when you have some violence, and then the moderates in comparison look more palatable. But that's exactly what happens on our side of the house. MLK was in the status quo. MLK won because he glorified nonviolence. Gandhi won because he glorified nonviolence. And in South Africa, they also won because they glorified nonviolence. So we do concede that on our side of the house, some violence happens anyway, but when the mainstream movement glorifies nonviolence, which is what the motion is about, we don't regret this, then we are the moderates who are actually accepted in the system and we get a place on the negotiating table. At that point, we are more likely to get FDI, more likely to get humanitarian aid, more likely to get peace awards and international clout, and more likely for the dominant ethnicity to accept us because we say we distance ourselves from the radicals, we are actually moderates, and that's when we actually get political concessions and we get integrated into the global system, so OO wins.
We thank the deputy of the opposition very much, and I'm happy to call upon the member of government here.
Okay, can I be seen and heard?
Yep.
Okay, just give me a sec. This is a bit, my computer's being, okay. Closing government enters this debate in two ways. First, why glorification affects people perceiving the movement, and second, how glorification affects people in the movement. Impact one is that violence, regardless of what the opening half wants to talk about, is either sometimes necessary or happens anyway. But what glorification means is that other people don't support revolutions which are violent and often effective or often just, which makes them less successful. And second, that people within these movements often buy into a martyrdom narrative through this glorification, which makes them even less willing to start non-violent protests for these reasons. Impact one, why is violence sometimes happening? And here I want to first begin by establishing two factual claims. The first is that violent revolutions, even if they're justified or not, because that's kind of what opening half is going to happen, often just like happen, right? And this is for many different reasons. This is often because like there are different kinds of revolutionaries that end up doing violent revolutionaries, and often they are disjointed from how just the cause is, right? So think about like deposing Ceausescu in Romania, think about how the Palestinian Liberation Army acts. The second thing that I want to establish is that in order for a revolution to succeed, you cannot simply rely on the internal country politics. And I think this is a big mistake that both open teams make. The reason for this is that there are many people around the world who are often the ones that place pressure on domestic governments. So like think of it this way, right? Obviously this narrative doesn't affect oppressors because like most people who are oppressors already don't like the activists who are trying to work against their best influence. What happens when you stop glorifying non-violent revolutions? When activists do often end up carrying out violent acts, you harm the willingness of external observers to be able to help them. What does this actually mean? This means, for example, significantly fewer support from foreign governments that care about values like democracy, that care about values like not oppressing minorities, putting things like sanctions on local governments. And this can be really, really effective. Why? Because autocratic states are often reliant on Western aid and external aid for the economic upliftment of their own people. So, for example, if the West had threatened to cut off Myanmar's aid much earlier, we would have had significantly fewer harms befalling the Rohingya population. But also, I want you to note, you don't even have to be violent in order to be portrayed as violent by a local government that controls the media. So for example, the Rohingyas have a wide range of protests at the start. The Burmese government chose to focus on the most violent ones, broadcast that to the world, and that's why the Arakan National Army and other Rohingyan activists did not get the support that they needed in the first place. Think about the way that the Israeli government only ever focuses on the Palestinian Liberation Army and never the initial peaceful protests that happen, like the most like worst forms of protest, because these are the ones that often lead to the most like sensationalism news stories, right? So think of after the death of George Floyd, people just kept talking about all the like riots that happened in Portland rather than the peaceful protests that occurred. This, therefore, is important because it explains then why we remove the way that external observers often choose to worsen and harm often innocent people on the ground by either doing one of two things. First, they sanction the wrong people. Think about the way that the West is complicit in not, for example, sanctioning Israel, but instead blocking Palestine because they believe that these are the terrorists that needed to be stopped. But second, it also prevents people from pushing for and supporting, sanctioning evil governments that have for far too long oppressed their own people. As a result, then, this is the most important impact in this debate because I've explained to you how Westerners are often made far less able to intervene. Second argument. When you glorify non-violent revolutions, you significantly delay prospective freedom fighters from taking part in both non-violent and violent measures when they are their most effective, and this narrative forces often minorities to suffer in silence when they are at their most vulnerable. In order to prove this argument then, I need to first prove that one, that the glorification of non-violent revolutions changes the mindset of social activists. Why is this the case? Because the framing that this debate desperately needs is the way that these oppressors not just change the way that they see themselves, but also how social activists change themselves. Three ways in which this happens. One, this changes the currency of social activism. The way that people are seen as heroes in the revolution or social activities are often the ones who make the most sacrifice, but often the ones who have the least amount of backlash. So it's the ones, for example, who suffer in silence in many cases that are seen as the biggest heroes. But two, because the way that people often model themselves are often, as earlier mentioned, on the ones of peaceful revolutionaries. But three, this also leads to each revolutionary prioritizing moral purity, not getting their hands dirty, or doing things like political pressure tactics when they are their most effective. What is the impact of this? Look, obviously provided sufficient pressure, non-violent revolutionaries turn violent. The problem with this is that it often forces leaders to tell their members to suffer in silence. This looks like things like being thrown in jail or being beaten out on the street without any action. But also, this significantly delays situations where people could turn from non-activists to non-violent activists, because the spectrum of non-violence to violence is often incredibly fuzzy. If I stand on a street and I'm incredibly disruptive and use angry language, in many cases, the imprimatur against violence often hates this, and often it means that people, even just people who are suffering on the ground, decide that they don't want to engage in protest as well. This is why, for example, there were many black people within the civil rights movement that criticized Martin Luther King's activism as being far too violent, or in many cases, far too extreme, or being too attention-grabbing in many of these instances. And that also means many problems. Before that, Yaku, opening.
But as per your own opening, MLK and Nelson Mandela were successful because they portrayed themselves as non-violent. So insofar as you want to have moderates who are different from the violent people, the best way to have this dual strategy is on opening opposition.
No. My point is really simple. You people say violence is bad, but who gets to define violence? This argument says that instead, anything that is often seen as aggression is tainted within the movement, which prevents people from becoming non-social activists to becoming social activists in the first place. And why is this delay bad? This one thing I want to note is that first, there is often an ideal window in which people around the world are focusing on your cause and oppression. The reason for this is because of things like the 24-hour news cycle and social media, in which often things change really quickly because people are just not really interested in your oppression in many cases. And what does this mean? When oppression occurs and you don't react quickly to spread your cause forward, people often forget and your cause becomes one of the many other causes that people don't care about. But two, it's worth noting, the longer oppression occurs, the harder it is to oppose it. Because let me give you an example. Once again, when the Rohingya were first being oppressed, it started with people being removed from schools or their language being erased. At this point, it would be hard for a government to justify a crackdown because the rhetoric against Rohingya had not permeated throughout the population. So if the Rohingya had begun by acting aggressively, standing for their rights, taking advantage of their international stage, it would have been much easier for us to create change by putting down the Burmese government. But because they waited, because they were scared of seeming aggressive, that is when the oppression got far worse and when they were eventually silenced. For all of these reasons, CG.
We thank the member of government very much and are happy to call upon the member of opposition here.
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you. This glorification in status quo does not only come from within movements. Yes, it does, but it also affects all of us. People who are looking on both from within and outside the country. That is what the other three teams have neglected to talk about, right? Like how other people are going to interact with this glorification and therefore villainize movements that have to be violent because they have no other choice. Gareth gives you two extensions. The first, he explains that in certain cases, even when you are non-violent, the state finds ways to portray you as violent anyways because they have a monopoly on information. I'm going to use this to take down the CEO later on, and I'll explain more there. But second, he explains that even if you talk about the people within these movements, the narrative of martyrdom is incredibly harmful and leads them to lead bad lives. In that, they sit down and they take it in silence because they believe that eventually these kinds of things will succeed. They believe that like Gandhi and MLK and Mandela, they conveniently ignore the violent people who came before them and they believe that they can succeed. This is incredibly harmful because it means that A, revolutions don't they don't strike while the iron is hot, they wait and delay, which makes them less likely to succeed. But second, in the interim, all of your people suffer and continue to be brutalized and genocided and whatever the horrible things that is happening that has provoked this revolution. This impact is incredibly important and we're going to weigh it later. Okay, let's first talk about CEO. CEO's main argument is that the government response gets less violent. They have a couple of reasons for this. Their first reason is that the political party wants, or the government wants to claim it as a core identity of their state, so they won't crack down. No. Like CEO misunderstand, right? So like the motion isn't about glorifying non-violence on the part of the state or the incumbent. It's on the part of the revolutionaries. Like we on Gov obviously support non-violence on the part of the state. I don't think glorification is what it's about. It's just like don't genocide people, right? So I think this mechanism is entirely symmetric. Their second mechanism is better. They say that now you can justify violence because the protesters are being violent. However, our extension flips this. The fact that oppressors are the ones who pick and choose who is portrayed as violent, which means that even if protesters are non-violent on their side of the house, they are still portrayed as such for all the reasons that Gareth explains to you. So on the issue of how protesters are perceived in that country, or whether there's like an excuse to crack down on them. Opposition have no delta. In fairness to them, closing government do respond. Their response is, well, it's unrealistic that these standards are so stringent and regulatory. But like, that's not the point of the argument, right? It's not that these standards are like stringent or like you can tell whether there's violence or not. The point isn't that these standards are vague, it's who's setting the standards. And we explained to you that overwhelmingly in the kinds of countries and the kinds of contexts in which these revolutions occur, these standards are set by the people who have all the power, which often are the oppressors. There is an asymmetry of information here, and opposition bench have a huge hole. Why just because you are non-violent will everyone believe you are non-violent? When, like, I think like OG's PY points out a good example of this as well. Their second argument is this will get hijacked. Guys, I don't think this is the tipping point. The reason you're hijacked by the military is because they have bigger guns than you. They don't explain. This like argument is entirely uncomparative, maybe because it was made in under a minute. Okay, that's dealt with CEO. Let's talk about why we weigh over opening government. I think there are two reasons. First, OG just focuses on a less important actor. And like this is, sorry, I want to clarify, this is weighing over both top half teams, right? They both focus on a less important actor, which is people within the movement. And like, if you listen to them, OG says they're really desperate. OO says they're psychopaths for some reason. And like, this means that the proportion of them for which this glorification is a tipping point is incredibly small. Because if you're super desperate or super irrational and like you're prone to violence anyways, even though we don't agree with this, if their characterization is true, it means that whether or not you look up to these examples, etc., means that this is incredibly small because you are motivated anyways. For whom is this really a tipping point? Everyone looking on, middle ground voters in the country and international scene, all of us, glorification of these things is what affects their predisposition to how they perceive a movement when they hear it on the news. And we argue that the glorification of non-violent movements means that all of us who aren't in that situation think, well, MLK could do it, why can't you? Why are you blowing up soldiers, pubs, and like, why are you taking hostages, etc., when you can just do it non-violently? We don't understand that for many of these individuals, this is simply not an option, and they've already tried this. And for all of us looking on, that's where the incredibly important impact of support that Gareth explains kicks in. So I just think that the actor we focus on is far more important than top half. Second, even within people within the movement, our impact is better than OG. Their impact is one, this erases their role. Two, on fragmentation. These are far more marginal. Why? Because OG don't tell you that they have a comparative. They don't tell you why movements are united on their side of the house, especially when they have like very different philosophies towards violence. So insofar as they don't give you a comparative, I think this is incredibly marginal. Gareth's argument on how we make the lives of these individuals far, far, far worse in the interim while they are waiting for the non-violent thing, which is never going to work to kick in, is so much more important. That is a far worse impact on the people within the movement. So even if you care about the top half's actor, I think closing government is the one that gives you the clearest impact. Before I move on to OO, I'll take your POI.
Yeah, but you never prove why we should have a good view of these revolutionaries. The Taliban view themselves as freedom fighters. You never prove why these groups actually deserve our sympathy in any way.
Okay, I got you, right? So OO's argument is that these revolutionaries are bad. I think this is incredibly unrealistic and entirely asserted. Like, the Taliban is one example, and I don't think most people consider them a revolutionary in this day and age. Like, look at the examples in the motion. Read the news. Most revolutions aren't Islamists and communists. Most of them are people who want freedom, people who don't like dictators, people who want to be stopped being genocided. And what's the structural reason for this so we aren't as assertive as them? I gave it to you in a POI that the successful revolutions tend to need a critical mass, which means they need the support of the people. They can't be super radical. Robert's response is, well, they just put military leaders in charge. One, this doesn't respond to the MAC of needing people in the international support, which means it is unlikely to be communists and Islamists. Two, again asserted, look at Bangladesh and Nepal, who chose people outside the movement to put in charge. So I think we have proven that these revolutionaries, like, more often than not, are fighting against oppression. This is something we ought to care about. Okay, finally on OO, they say that violence is bad and we need to stop it. We explain that non-violent revolutions are tried first on both sides. And I don't want to rely on OG here, even though I think OG are kind of correct. I'm going to give you separate reasons. On top of highly personal cost, there's a high movement cost, weapons, critical mass, people willing to take fire. Second, most reasonable leaders rise to the top of the movement. It's not psychopaths like they assert. The people who rise to the top are the people who have a proven track record of getting concessions. So it's the people who are least likely to be psychopaths. So like, even irrational people care about self-preservation. I don't think they can push on us to defend a comparative where it's like super radical people who want to put themselves in the line of fire. Like, their comparative is literally China funding a proxy war. I think this probably happens anyways. What is the impact here? In the instances where non-violent means would work, it will work on both, like they'll do it first on both sides of the house. The delta is where it hasn't worked. And we explain that if these people in these brutal conditions have a revealed preference for risking their lives and doing violence, who are we to say no? They are the ones who have a revealed preference for making this trade-off. We're willing to support that. Closing government.